See, I'm basically going to share about why surface vegetation is important to archaeologists, but mostly focusing on how could we give greater attention to this overlooked resource, and how I can propose to guide the archaeological gaze, as it were. And I guess I'd like to start with kind of the photo you see in front of you. There's this time where VLM archaeologist, a friend of mine, and I were trying to relocate a site that was only recorded about 10 years before, and it showed a standing cabin, you know, albeit a little dilapidated. And, you know, it shouldn't have been hard to relocate. We followed the little narrative of how to get there and look for clues in the site setting and expected to see the standing building. And beyond it, you see, in the picture, you see this little mountain kind of meadow clearing, and the area has been heavily grazed by cattle. And I kept going around it, and I just could not find this log cabin. And so I pulled out the form, and I was looking in the little vegetation setting section of the form. And it mentioned quaking aspen in it, and that stood out to me because as I was coming up on the road that followed the creek, I noticed that the quaking aspens were in short supply. And so I look around the tree canopy instead of on the ground, as I'm so used to looking. And there it was, standing out like a neon sign, and my eyes go down, and then I notice this cluster of trees, and the other archaeologist finds it at the same time. And I came over, and I was looking, and I noticed that there was all this Douglas fir that was growing up out of essentially what the cattle had mulched away the remains of the cabin. And but what's interesting is the deposits from this cabin and the mulching created a little environmental niche for these trees, you know, whose pine cones rolled off the roof, or you know, wind and water and so forth collected alongside the former walls in concentrations, as well as squirrels who like to bury a lot of pine cones along the walls and foundations. And look at all these trees that grew up out of it. And so I bring this up as a kind of an example because archaeologists tend to treat vegetation, generally speaking, as kind of a hindrance to our work, rather than kind of looking at how it could be our friend potentially if we had some kind of semblance of what to look for. Let's see. Right. So I'll be going over kind of why this hasn't been studied very well, and propose a conceptual basis for anthropogenic vegetation, and then I'll propose a model of how to sort of guide the archaeological gaze, as it were. So the first issue we have is vegetation. The value of surface vegetation and archaeological sites tends to not be fully appreciated. Kind of organized more or less from top to bottom, you could see kind of some broad categories and areas of how surface vegetation matters and is relevant to archaeology and the work of cultural heritage management. But its value and how it's realized is kind of uneven. And I could spend an entire talk all about what you see essentially on this slide broken down. And if we have time at the end, and if you guys are interested, we could return to it. But I'll just kind of leave you these broad categories you see here, touch on its use in kind of providing context for site form readers about why area was missed or not missed, to how it gives clues to archaeologists to understand how well preserved is the subsurface area. It can be indications of have certain utilitarian uses and certain types of sites and landscapes. It's also, of course, recognized as indicators of past land use and human activities and site indicators. It can help us figure out the orientation of a site when we have certain pieces of the puzzle and that are linked to vegetation, and we know certain patterns and landscaping patterns of the period to plant certain things in certain configurations of a site, we can help kind of ferret out where the rest of other things may be hiding. It's also been used in relative dating and in iconometry and forensic applications even. There's its use in trade and establishing travel routes and relationships, and traveling through space. And it's also held very important social importance in the construction and the making of places, the places they are, as well as use in and expressions of belief and in magic and symbolic uses of group identity. But as I mentioned before, the treatment of these sites and archaeologists' kind of imagination of what we could do with them is uneven. 59% of archaeologists surveyed claimed that have used some kind of vegetal data in their research. And chief reasons that they said that they used it was essentially in hopes of recognizing subsurface cultural features, or to recognize to further express signs of disturbance or the integrity of what lies kind of beneath. But there are also those who, a large portion of those who don't use it, and that's because they've said it hasn't played well into their research, or that it wasn't required. And why this wasn't required in their research design kind of brings me to my next point. Surface vegetation and living cultural heritage can be tricky to fit into cultural resource management. And that's because, for one, archaeologists are typically not trained as botanists. There's a kind of philosophical bias that we're subjected to in our society that we don't really think about necessarily. This whole idea that there is nature and there is culture, and there's this whole dichotomy between the two. And that kind of attitude is kind of subconsciously reflected in the writing of our federal and state laws and even federal agency policies. And even taking NHPA, the National Historic Preservation Act, as an example of one of these laws, the kinds of sites that we consider and submit for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places is a little bent towards historical architects. If you had to fill out one of those things. There's also, in cultural heritage management, this industry is bigger than archaeologists, and yet a lot of the regulations and the guidance that govern this work tends to be biased towards archaeologists having to justify things that matter in terms of an archaeological sense, and potentially leaving out other kinds of cultural resources, including intangible ones, can be trickier to pin down in ways. And so one of the things that sort of suffer from this, these different kind of biases are, and we'll talk about this shortly in more detail, are the places in between. We tend to fixate on the artifacts and the stuff and the things of the four walls, the structures, and then the spaces in between is kind of an afterthought. And another issue we have is, because of these other previous issues I brought up, there's a lack of systematic records. And because of that, they don't, surface vegetations, if we try to use site form recollections of the vegetal setting, it's like comparing apples and oranges. And so they just don't, it doesn't lend itself very well for research value. But there are exceptions to the consideration of surface vegetation in the context of archaeology. And of this, I'm talking about peeled trees or culturally modified trees. There are also NPS bulletins on traditional cultural places and rural landscapes that both mention how vegetation could be contributing elements and be of archaeological and cultural relevance. And of course, plants can enter the kind of conscience of governmental consultation related discussions between federally recognized tribes and their agency's archaeologists when tribes point out vegetation worth considering, because under the kind of umbrella of religiously or culturally significant properties. And so there's blind spots for sure, but then there are existing avenues that we can use to justify incorporating this into our research designs. So kind of springboarding on the issue of scarce documentation, I kind of highlight here with this picture. This is a site form in Montana where I highlighted in yellow just the interesting choices of words, and this is a common issue across the country. Notice how they describe standard southwestern Montana wildflowers, or native and non-native grasses, non-native weeds. Boy, they're just covering all their bases, aren't they? So you can see why this is kind of, we can't use this very much for research. It's all over the place. Actually, I'm sorry, this is not one site form. This is several site forms who I just took an excerpt of their vegetal setting to compare the difference, the variability in practices and when it comes to recording these things. So why is variability a key thing in this whole talk? Here's a picture of a friend of mine named Ellie, and she was helping me in the field doing kind of a vegetation survey. And one of the things I was asking her and another friend of mine there was to keep an eye out for anomalous patterns of vegetation, because at the time I hadn't yet articulated what to essentially look for. I just thought it was more obvious. And so here's a picture of Ellie looking around. And one of the things that dawned on me from this experience of my friends who are quite befuddled about what I was asking them to keep an eye out for was I realized that when we use words like anomalous, and we're talking more than just vegetation here, you have to have a concept of what is normal before you can have a concept of what is out of place. And to use words like anomalous is a little lazy. And it's possible to pin down the attributes and qualities of what we really mean when we use words like anomalous. And so all of this is, in a sense, kind of a culmination of me addressing a problem I found myself facing, and I think other people might also face. So kind of moving on to this idea, from this idea of the problem of words like anomaly, we have this word like anthropogenic. It's a key part of this whole discussion. And the term anthropogenics you'll find in our archaeology-related journals increasingly since the Anthropocene kind of came into academics' minds in the 70s, and people became a lot more environmentally conscious of how humans are just on a large, wide global scale have in some way or another touched and shaped the planet in different ways. And so one of the words to somehow describe this unseen human hand in the environment is anthropogenic. And it's been increasingly in use in the last 20 years. This term anthropogenic, it came from the environmental studies field. And we might ask, if we believe that we are in the Anthropocene, and we want to use words like anthropogenic, isn't it kind of pointless? Because if everything is anthropogenic, then this word doesn't have anything to distinguish it from anything else. And I would disagree. I'd say that the term anthropogenic needs to be broken down by how exactly it is anthropogenic, not that it's merely anthropogenic, period. And that distinction is what gives it salt, it gives it flavor and meaning. And so we need to better pin down what qualities make something anthropogenic in one way or another. Otherwise, we continue to miss one another's understanding of this highly variable term. Here in the bottom left corner, I show some areas, some categories, and archaeologists' personal definitions, and noting their connotations and how they use the term in writing, and realized that there were interesting contradictory categories in what this word means to them. And some take very hard stance stances that the word anthropogenic is used when talking about human created or caused things, as opposed to others who say, no, it's used to refer to indirect or human influenced kinds of things. And then there are different disagreement on, there's combinations of these things, like whether it's intentional or unintentional, direct or indirect modification, and even differences in the connotative use of it in terms of scale. And so because of the issue, in what we think we mean when we use words like anthropogenic, I ended up tracing it to a gap in a more troubling gap in one of the most foundational archaeological concepts. See, what we consider sites, are also known as site constituents, can be an artifact, a cultural feature, or an ecofact. And we typically put anthropogenic under kind of the umbrella of ecofacts. And while the definitions of ecofact or artifacts and features are fairly well agreed upon and understood, ecofacts, on the other hand, is kind of this elastic filling idea. If you think of these three pillars of what makes like an archaeological site as an Oreo, and the artifact and the features are like the chocolate cookies, and the ecofact is like the squishy icing between them. This elastic and variably defined concept here has a couple issues. There's disagreement on, when we say ecofact, on whether we're referring only to biological materials. It also has particular problems because it has this connotation as pertaining to remains, meaning it excludes the value of the surface record or even living heritage. Ecofacts are also a kind of problematic because they tend to end up on the fray or the periphery, when greater treatment and interest in research questions and a lot more goes into focus on the artifacts and the features, which have a tendency to have more durable materials. And also it tends to be used to address more simple questions. And probably most important in my critique of ecofact is, what do we really mean when we say it is unmodified? Or it doesn't have to be modified. And when we say modified and not modified, what does that really break down to meaning? And the issue is it fails to recognize a lot of indirect effects of humans, this sort of domino effect I will talk about later. So all of this is, I think, culminated and expressed this problem of variability by something Schiffer wrote. And this is the only quote I could think off the top of my head that I will inflict upon you. I know it's a great sin in PowerPoints to put a big old quote like this on here, but it's so important to my point. See, Schiffer basically wrote the book on considering, mapping the behavioral processes that resulted in, cultural materials being deposited where they are in the archaeological record, and recognizing and tracing the so-called natural or non-human site formation processes, since a site is left alone and sort of quote unquote nature reclaims the site and interrupts it in a way that it's not in the same configuration as it was left due to human activities. And after he wrote this whole big book on things about like taphonomy and how like sites could be disturbed by things like tree roots and frost heave and erosion and so forth, he realizes he basically chalks up the archaeologist as a third force, almost compared to almost like a force of nature in what we end up having left for perpetuity, in the same way as like the forces of nature. And he says that the behavior of the archaeologist is the greatest source of variability in the archaeological record. It's the archaeologist who determines what's found and what is not, and what is saved and what is not, what is counted to and what is not, what is reported and what is not, and above all, it's archaeologists who may or may not strive to identify and ascertain the influence of other formation processes. So we'll go into what are the sort of assumptions that are kind of built into my idea of anthropogenic vegetation. And I think I would break them down into these 5 concepts. There's the idea I start with of ecosystem engineering. It's this idea that certain organisms essentially shape the environment around them. And this includes humans, not just, it's not limited to humans, as you see here. And we take that idea and I further flesh it out with this research program called Historical Ecology. And I use some of their postulates, mainly seizing on the idea that, yeah, all human or all the Earth's ecosystems have been affected, particularly by human activity. And that these particular effects, or these modifications to the environment, are not necessarily good or bad. Humans do not necessarily always increase or decrease species diversity, and that there's these differences between the different societies and their different activities affect the landscape in different ways. And so that's an important idea to seize upon, different ways that I'm going to further elaborate on. And I give it further structure by borrowing from the field of linguistics. I know, it seems very weird, but archaeologists use words like archaeological signature. This is an archaeological signature for this X activity, right? This means that. Well, when we use words like that, we are unknowingly dipping into the well of linguistic theory. And so I thought it was appropriate to use some of their ways of thinking about how we construe meaning. This X, we see X means, Y activity. And so there's this field called, I know it's a big mouthful, Peircean pragmatic semiotics. And Peirce, he had a model about how we make meaning between ideas and the things that we see or sense, how we connect this pool of possible meaning to things that we see. And he attributed we draw meaning in 3 different ways. And the one I'm just going to focus on here is a sign mode that he calls an index. And there are 2 kinds of indexes. Well, what are indexes? Indexes are when we draw meaning between things that have a cause and effect relationship. So you see smoke and fire comes to mind, right? That would be like a cause and effect relationship. Archaeologists think in those kinds of terms too. And the way we draw those relationships through evidence is a whole other discussion, but is also included in previous mentioned guy Schiffer in a book he wrote called The Principles of Behavioral Archaeology. But anyways, I will digress. So there are 2 types of indexes. And they're important because they reconcile those previously kind of contradictory ideas about this is anthropogenic and that's anthropogenic. And I've been able to use this to unify them together in a way that makes logical sense. See, when I use it to assert something as anthropogenic, to help wrestle together the idea that even plants that are created or domesticated or tooled by humans can be just as anthropogenic as those that are influenced indirectly by humans. Non-referential indexes that you see here on the left, there's a peeled tree. They are those that that provide standalone, direct, contextual details and variables. They basically are the context. You could pick that tree up and move it into all these different contexts, and it's still meaningful. Like this is, caused and made by associated with humans. But and it's these non-referential indexes that get the lion's share of research in the archaeological literature on surface vegetation in archaeology. However, referential indexes, this is the trickier one to pin down. And these are those that you need an assemblage of things, or you need, essentially it's not meaning, these elements are not meaningful in and of themselves, but when seen together, they together offer up these variables together offer up their context that suggests that humans are involved. And so I took those opposing categories I mentioned before, and I arranged them on this, intrinsic anthropogenism versus extrinsic anthropogenism. And I put in little parentheses what category of index it pertains to. And so building on this idea, okay, humans are like other animals, and that we shape the environment around themselves, that there are legacies left behind to these modifications, that these legacies can provide standalone context and association with humans, and those that need to be seen together in an assemblage in order to be meaningful and associated with humans. And these things that you're seeing have a name. They're called traces, borrowing from behavioral archaeology again. So this is important because I'm going from this conceptual idea and I'm breaking it down further into tangibles, things that can ultimately be observed and measured and recorded, and that will hopefully provide us the apples-to-apple comparisons we need to aggregate the data in order to say, hey, when we see this plant or these qualitative, these properties of these plants, has to do with humans. So traces are the idea that that all human behaviors potentially leave some sort of evidence behind from their activities. And previously, I just lashed it together with the ideas that these kinds of traces can be vegetal in nature, right? Not just in terms of soil and buildings and other artifacts and so forth. So these categories of traces, this is bigger than just surface vegetation, but I took it and I applied it to vegetation. These are categories that provide 4 lenses or 4 places to look, 4 kinds of data or context. That's the archaeologist mantra, context is everything. But we don't always agree on the full extent of context. And so this is a useful kind of roadmap to like, hey, did we remember to think about describing and recording this and that? And so all that kind of thinking is built into things like our site records. And so when we think about data in this way, it helps us, read traces in a very kind of Sherlock Holmes kind of way. And so I incorporate these trace model categories into my model I'll talk about for how like referential indexes apply to surface vegetation, called extrinsic anthropogenism. So we don't have to look aimlessly for what is merely anomalous. Rather, we have to trace categories to help us map exactly what makes something anomalous to us in the first place. And so you got the formal dimension, or you can call it the formal context if you want. And those are basically the physical makeup and descriptive attributes and qualities of a thing. As opposed to the spatial context or dimension, this is mapping an object's things location in space. Think of the XYZ location when in an excavation, for example, or think of it as also including the distribution of stuff across space, or the relationship of a thing to another thing to one another. How close together are they, and so forth. There's the frequency dimension. This is the measurement of things like abundance and the density and the frequency of occurrence of the stuff. Then there's the relational element. This is the affinity and pattern of certain objects that are grouped together. And this is a harder one. It's a lot less sexy to recognize or to talk about, and harder to recognize in the field. It requires usually more data aggregated to substantialize and to statistically compare and test for these co-occurrences. But that doesn't stop us in archaeological folk wisdom over the course of one's career to learn that, hey, of all my years, I've noticed that this particular plant behaves this way, or this particular species occurs with X cultural feature. And that kind of archaeological folk wisdom is sort of passed down, but it's seldom actually given credit. There are two kind of local heroes actually in Texas who have worked in this area though, and one of them is Jenny McWilliams, and another one I'm aware of is Bo Nelson, and you could get with them or me, and I can kind of point you guys if you're interested in some of the works available on this. But anyways, hopefully, this model will help you further kind of gaze direct your gaze out in the field. And so I gave an example of how things, botanical matters can be, where they fall along these 4 dimensions or these 4 kinds of contexts and the kinds of data that you could collect on them. And so I built on this idea of trace categories, this idea of plant associations. Let's see, I'll say that when I say plant associations, I'm borrowing a concept from basically the origins of ecology. This would be a field in Europe, more popularly known as phytosociology or plant sociology, and in the US, it might be more popularly understood as plant community ecology. So what are plant associations? Plant associations is the idea that plant communities are seen together because there's some kind of biotic or abiotic condition that is favorable to them. And therefore, plant associations are indicators of those said conditions in the environment. So this obviously relates to archaeology, right? If people are engaging in mining activities with copper, then it can attract some copper-loving plants. Same thing for other kinds of heavy metals and certain heavy metal-loving plants, or people enriching things with fertilizers, because there was a pen there, animal pen there, and it attracts certain nitrogen-loving plants. Those are human examples of how humans can have certain kinds of plant associations. So naturally, there are those plants that benefit from our tilling or fertilizing or enriching of the soils, industrial waste lots, gravel roads, or trash that enrich the soils with phosphates and calcium. Take like shell middens, for example. Burials, controlled burns, grazed pastures, logging, mine landscapes, where different kinds of metals accumulate. These all can attract their own trait plant communities. So I'll turn my attention to the other concept that's related to it, and it's this idea called synanthropy. Synanthropy is a Greek word, means seen with man, and these are organisms that derive benefit from human modifications to the environment. And these species, under this umbrella of synanthropy, can be broken down on whether they're native species or introduced species. They call a nice little 25-cent word for native species that derive benefit from human modifications of the environment are called apophytes. And those introduced species that derive benefit from human modifications of the environment are called anthropophytes. And these plant associations, due to human manipulations to the environment, are called synanthropes, can be further subdivided and broken down by those that which are formerly called hemerophiles. Those are culture lovers. That's another word for a synanthrope. However, not all synanthropes are equally synanthropic. There exists a spectrum that even the glaring absence of species that are sensitive to human presence can be meaningful. Another word for a kind of human sensitive species, or also known as an urban sensitive species, is called a hemerophobe. Another term that's being used here is, of course, the urban sensitive species. And these can also be indicators of humans in the environment. Also, not all species are necessarily benefiting or negatively impacted by human modifications of the environment. See, a species, just because what's good for one species might not be good for another, and what one type of activity might be good for one kind of synanthrope, but that same synanthrope might be bothered and perturbed by different kind of human activity. So, I don't know, take uranium mining, say like as this rooterall loves this disturbed road, gravelly conditions along the road, but all of a sudden, maybe it's subjected to fire or radiation or a number of other kinds of human activities. Well, now it's not exactly, in other words, sometimes synanthropes are not like permanently synanthropic as a species. It might be synanthropic and to a particular human activity, a particular environmental niche that humans made. So I'm trying to help you understand that the relationship between certain organisms and the human modified environment can be sliced and diced a couple different ways. So in other words, it's not enough to note the presence of cultivars. See, even those that favor certain microenvironments left by humans in the footprint of privies, and foundations, and abandoned roads and ditches, pet rocks for moisture and shade, and mulch from dilapidated structures, even the absence of human-sensitive species in an area of where they are expected to otherwise be is worth our notice. So let me get on to my proposed model. I couldn't fit the whole thing on one slide, so it's still legible. But if you refer to your handout, you'll see it all on one nice page. And also in the handout, I break it down in a table form. There are a lot more references and sources for each of these categories, but since the table you're seeing is tooled for an article in review, our journal articles tend to frown on if you have more than one in-text citation, at a time. So I had to cut it down to a bare minimum of about 4, including the table, which they count against word limits. Am I kvetching too much? I'm kvetching too much. Let me, here's also the extrinsic anthropogenism umbrella. And then notice how it's broken down by those aforementioned dimensions or context. So let me just show you some examples. That'll help. Here you see we first look at direct modifications to plants, things like tool marks in peeled trees, actual peeled trees, which are the activity done by tribes to essentially separate the bark from certain species of trees to oftentimes get at the cambium underneath, because it's kind of like a sweet delicacy in the Northwest particularly. Sometimes it's nicknamed Indian ice cream. Other times peels are made for navigational markers. And then even things like axed trees, logged trees, in other words, blazed trees are all examples of direct modifications to plants on what to look for. Another one, less well systematically studied, is bench trees. Texas has a great credit to the research of this area in a book called the Comanche marker trees, if I remember correctly. And it was written by a couple different authors. I think it was Hooser and a few others. One of them happened to be Comanche Tipo, if memory serves. And it's the only systematic guide to the study of bent trees that I'm aware of. There are a couple coffee table books out there. People have gone around the country and kind of collected photos of them, although they aren't really well studied and substantiated. But I highly recommend, if you're interested, Comanche marker trees, a Texas book out there. Check it out on Amazon or something. It's a really well put together book. Another category of intrinsic anthropogenism, of course, are cultivars. And you can break that down further by native cultivars and introduced cultivars. And it's worth doing this, breaking it down, because, if you look in the upper right corner, here's an example of European gooseberry. And it was at a mining town in around the Flathead area of Montana, in the western Montana. And see, if archaeologists went and recorded, even if we were fortunate enough for them to record the presence of goosefoot at that site, we still fail to see how it relates to humans potentially, because it could, there are native varieties of gooseberry that'll be dispersed by birds and so forth, and so we might not chalk that up to humans. But this particular human variety that was brought over by inhabitants, on the other hand, is important and worth knowing to recognize. And I'll talk about another example of how even native gooseberries and currants, even though they're dispersed by birds, can be meaningful to us in a minute. So jumping to the extrinsic example, extrinsic anthropogenism examples. I'll start with the relational context. You guys are probably familiar with the idea of forest succession and how certain activities, things like fire and so, land clearance and grazing, pasture, and farming and tilling and so forth can have their own sort of successional phases or trajectories for how the forest will grow back. So that would be an example of botanical co-occurrences. There's another one that can be an example of the relational context at work, where you have certain plants that are known to have an association between a certain species occurring in combination with a particular cultural feature. Here you have bee balm and wolfberry, coral bean, the coral bean plant. Another category worth looking for is the formal and frequency context. I kind of combine them together. And the one here I'm showing is examples of indirect modification of plants. This is one of the least studied areas in surface vegetation and archaeological context, which I think are some of the coolest, because I love trying to read the unseen human hand at work in the environment. Here's an example of a tree plantation and also a road on the upper left corner with some ponderosa pines. And you'll see this thing, this will happen, this is a case of phototropism, where the branches are gonna grow up to where there's the least competition for light. And so you may see this where there are the edges of a former field when there was no tree canopy because it was all cleared. And sometime when you're in a park or along our old road or whatever, just pay attention to look up the trunk of a tree and notice that their trees tend to grow branches asymmetrically and asymmetrically towards wherever the best places they could get their light. And so if you find these symmetrical patterns and branches leaning towards the light. Now, granted, that you have to factor in, especially in Texas, this is quite evident here, areas of high wind and the way, branches will grow on sort of the, what do you call it? Basically the downslope, whatever the downslope, downwind, I guess, of where the wind is going. And so you have to factor that into these observations. But yeah, keep an eye out for how things like land clearance and opening up the canopy in the lines and geometric patterns of these can be indicative of human activities. Now I'll go back to that. I was talking about gooseberry and currants. Here's an example. I've seen this over and over in Western Montana. Places where there used to be foundations to wooden structures and fence lines for around fence plots in cemeteries, including fences around the whole cemetery itself, oftentimes have bird dispersed species like currants, wax currant particularly, and a variety of gooseberries, which will grow up around in L shape or rectangular kind of growth patterns around these fence lines. And that's because humans essentially created a perch for the bird, and there they go and deposit their seeds and their waste. And after these fences are all dilapidated and gone, the legacy of the bird perches from them are probably going to still be around to observe. And so this is how the humble native bird dispersed species, growth patterns is worth looking for, or looking towards, I mean. And in the upper right corner in the image below it, here's another example of coppicing. It's particularly popular in like the UK, around hedges, or in New England and out east in general, where people, would plant things as a kind of a border or fencing kind of strategy, basically hedges. And they would, when you cut certain species down, they'll grow back with even more trunks, kind of like a hydra. And it's also really convenient for harvesting for burning materials. So that's one of the reasons it's encouraged and continues to be done to this day. But it's also something that happens with continued things like land clearance, and with these particular species that will grow back in this way. That's worth looking for or looking towards. I mean, so when you see instances of a lot of coppicing, and especially if it's in combination with things like examples of phototropism on the left-hand corner here, that's definitely also something to keep an eye out for. So another area of formal and frequency context involving plants is something called Adaptic Effects. Adaptic Effects is just a fancy way of saying something that pertains to the soils. And these can be broken down by those aforementioned hemerophobic and hemerophilic effects. So they used to use these terms to describe plants, but as I pointed out, like the word synanthrope, there isn't always a one-size-fits-all idea of a synanthrope, because one activity might benefit a certain synanthrope, but the same synanthrope might not benefit from another kind of human activity. So that's why I prefer to describe them as effects rather than trying to say it's in the nature of that particular species to be a synanthrope. And so I think this concept captures that. And so this can happen, these positive and negative effects can be observed in a couple different ways. Here is a old 70-plus-year-old animal pen. There's some evidence of some fencing attached to the homesteads, like barn. You can see that's an example of lower abundance and lower vitality. I guess I should explain here then what sociability and vitality are. These are qualitative categories used by phytosociologists. Sociability is how we describe, there's like a scale of 5, to describe how colonized that plant is or how sparse it is in relation to one another. Vitality, on the other hand, it has categories, 4 categories on whether or not that species is essentially not reproducing, it's not completing its life cycle, it's essentially related to another category. Where is it? I don't see it. There's another category in here called plant stress, and there are multiple categories of plant stress, like giantism, and you have plants that grow larger than they should, or those that are dwarfed and are much smaller than they should be. If you see a pattern of these kinds of plant stresses, or leaves wilting and turning yellow, in particular patterns compared to their neighbors of the same species, that's something worth looking into. Note the absence of urban sensitive species as an example of like a hemerophobic effect. Its opposite are those full obligate synanthropes I mentioned earlier, or a concentration of apophytes. Here's a kind of visual example of the scales of sociability. I couldn't find a visual. I always saw like the scale that they described, but no one ever created a visualization so it can be on the same page. So I created one. And we're talking, another way you can measure abundance is in terms of cover of a plant. So how much percentage of the ground is it taking up? And so there are some available resources if you want to learn how to do that and to describe it. Here's what I was talking about with plant stresses. There's a list of different kinds of categories of plant stress and a whole picture there. So this is an example of a heterophobic effect on plants to look out for. And here I made little thumbnail sketches of all of these extrinsic anthropogenic categories, the gray area being a cultural deposit. And oh, I wish all those were labeled for you here. Let's see. There's a little lag every time I hit the button. Okay. Here we go. Here in A, we have an example of higher cover, where they kind of stretch the plant ever so slightly so that the shadow it's casting underneath it or its cover is greater than those around it. B, here we have an example of higher sociability. In C, we have a concentration of apophytes. In D, we have an example of higher vitality. E, we have an example of lower cover. F, we have an example of lower sociability. G is an example of urban sensitive species absence or other conspicuous absence of expected species. H is an example of lower vitality, and I an example of plant stress. So moving on to another category in extrinsic anthropogenism is the spatial context. First one worth looking for is the presence of human dispersed anthropophytes. So here, even though whitebark pine is a native species, it is outside its natural range here in the Pryor Mountains, growing up out of a crow fasting bed. And this is also meaningful because the crow would collect boughs of whitebark pine branches because they make soft bedding, and they would lay there for a few days in supplication and in fasting for whatever their sort of oath or whatever the healing or answers that they're looking for. So their fasting experiences may take the form of vision quest, and they might not. I just bring it up because it's a misnomer with fasting beds that they're not all vision quest sites. And if you want to learn more about that, I have a great resource to share with you for those of you who are particularly interested in Plains Indian archaeology. Some other examples of the spatial context, these could be patterns, geometric adaptic patterns, meaning the soil underneath that's been modified by humans. That could be the footprint of a privy, the footprint or the foundation of a building. These sort of non-random geometric patterns is something worth looking for. These are also patterns through space that I had mentioned earlier. If you look in the thumbnail closely, there are different trees there, and there's examples of all of these. There are Indian trails in the Midwest from pawpaw that was carried by native peoples in between their settlements along the Indian along the trails, and they're consuming the pawpaw and then spitting out the seeds along the way. And so continued use over time essentially increases more and more of this useful plant that they would pick along the way, further reinforcing it. And so you could still follow these pathways to this very day. This would be a case where its distribution through space is indicative of humans. And of course, obviously, we have, lastly, planting regimes, things like plantations and rows along roads and so forth. There's some examples here of non-random distribution patterns. There's a 130-year-old corral. There are pieces of fence going around it, stuck to trees and some up the ground, that the bareness, the lack of vitality, you could say, or the low sociability of the species in the footprint of this highly disturbed corral outlived the fencing. I mean, that's incredible. Here's an example of a 90-year-old privy footprint, and it's the same grass species in the footprint as it is around it, but it just has greater vibrancy, greater vitality to it. And so if an archaeologist only recorded the presence of that grass, it could be written off easily as an indicator of humans. But if they said, high vitality of X species, well, now we're cooking with oil. So another example, planting regime. There's a native species, black cottonwood, along a homestead road in the bottom left corner. And here we have an example of a concentration of apophytes and lower vitality, the same species, along the former fence line and dirt road. So these are all examples of non-random distribution patterns that we could keep in mind. So lastly, I propose my own definition for anthropogenic vegetation. And it is a little bit of a mouthful, but I feel like it's a little bit more pinned down than what we had to work with before. I'd consider it the discernible phenomena of first-hand or second-hand changes to vegetation's dimensions of variability. That's a term I'm borrowing from behavioral archaeology, which results intentionally or unintentionally from human activities. Examples of which may include, but are not limited to, a species cultivation, an alteration to its form or appearance, a change to its formal properties and qualities, or change from its habit of spatial distribution, geometric growth habit, or spatial displacement. In other words, out of place vegetation. So these all are ways I've tried to pin down what we mean by anomalous vegetation. So here's my kind of quick little, some quick little suggestions on what we might do differently. I'd suggest we'd all add some local plant guides to our library, including getting local ethnobotanical resources on the areas of where we do our work or have interest. I'd encourage botanical inventory. There's many different ways you can do it. I don't think we should depend on regurgitated environmental reports that speak about vegetation in very sweeping, general, very regional ways, because it doesn't speak to the little micro, environmental niches that sites create. That's something I've noticed in what we record is the vast majority of species that recorded on site forms are tree species. And yet, nationally, and it's fairly the same across the board for the country, if you look at life forms or growth habits or plant types, however you want to call it, things like trees and shrubs, herbs, forbs, grasses, mosses, of all those life forms, trees make up 6% of the biodiversity of species. And so when we're characterizing the ecosystem or the environmental setting of a site, we're capturing that little window of about 6% of what could be out there. And so there's a tree bias. There's a bias towards recording cultivars. There's a bias towards recording sometimes only culturally significant species. Sometimes there's a bias to avoid describing weeds because they don't think it could be associated with humans. But as I've just demonstrated, weeds love us and they love what we do with all our sites. So they're really meaningful. They're worth also describing, also because they're indicative of past human disturbances of the soil. They're also indicators of disturbance itself and therefore the integrity of what lies beneath. And so I also think we should describe where possible qualitative shifts in the vegetation. And one way that we can articulate that is with the scale of sociability, scale of vitality. You can couch it in terms of the cover. I'm not saying we have to do this for every species necessarily, but if you're trying to describe what makes it anomalous, you could couch those particular ones of interest in these kinds of terms. And you can also note if there's the presence of plant stress going on, as I mentioned before. So yeah, it will help. The more we're trying to be more systematic, to aggregate the data, to demonstrate these relationships between activities, sites, and plant behavior. I think also something we could do is we can note the location of colonization patterns or these geometric patterns or other qualitative shifts in vegetation that we're seeing, like we do with other things on a site plan map. If you're doing a site sketch map and you're noting just the way we do with debutage, you know, no, we have to necessarily put the exact location of every flake, right? We could just note, there here be the cluster of debutage or lithic scatter. Well, why can't we do that with, you know, particularly out of place vegetation that we've been talking about? For those with more time on their hands, we can engage in what Sanford and Newman have written about. They've come up with this method called tree demographic profiles in their books on practicing archaeology and cultural resource management, where they get to detail about linking the diameter breast height of trees, you know, in other words, how wide around the trunks are of certain species, and arranging it in a way that we would with other kinds of artifacts on a chart to depict the sort of trends in popularity, and as it tapers off over time. We can do that essentially with things like the DBH of specific species within a radius of a certain feature or a site. We can interview landowners and locals, descendant communities, and other archaeologists on what their folk wisdom is on the relationship between plants and sites. There's archival research yet to do on past landscapes and past people's cultural valuation and introduction of plant species to places. And lastly, there's lichenometry that we can do. You know, a lot of well-meaning people want to preserve headstones, and they scrape off all the lichens on it. But those lichens, their growth patterns could actually be used to date stone features in the area. So if you have a teepee ring or a cairn, the growth of that, you know, we want to note the type of stone and identify the type of lichen and note the sizes of these growths all over them, and put that in your records too before scraping off the lichens. Because you can use those known things with dates on them, like the headstones or known built foundations that have a date assigned to them. We can take that, you know, the rate over time for those growths that you noticed, and we can apply that in the local area that shares the same climate with the same stones, and narrow down its age. Takeaways. Terms like ecofact, human modified, anthropic, anthropogenic have served as conceptual duct tape. Vegetal anthropogenism includes an array of human cause and effects in vegetation that have included the aforementioned, you know, formal and frequency and spatial and relational context. They all manifest in plants too, not just in other types of resources. So if you guys are interested in a lot more on it, I'd be happy to send you my work on it, and a lot more useful references that might be, you know, I have a copy of even I can send to you, not just the link, not the link, sorry, the reference. Yeah, does anyone have any questions or comments?